The whole southeast is staying dry right now. Some areas are happy about that, some not so happy. Chris and I will talk about some of these things during the November 17th edition of the Water Resources Outlook. So now we're going to talk about the observed precipitation, but this month I'm going to show it a little bit differently. Here's the 30-day precipitation, but this is the observed, and one of the things you'll notice is the white area inside of Georgia, Alabama. These are all areas that have received little to no rain during the last 30 days. And even as you get to the periphery of where we have some light blues in the western Carolinas, down into Florida, we really have been very dry. And so when you compare this to the normal, what we would normally get during this time of year, obviously that same area that has seen no rain is extremely low. They've seen 0% of rainfall. We usually do departure from normal, but I decided to show the percent of normal. Even along the coast, since the tropical rain fell during the Hurricane Matthew, it has backed off, and we haven't seen nearly as much rainfall during that time. So even some of those areas are 25 to 50% below normal since the hurricane. Now that's been a blessing in that it helps them to recover, give them an opportunity. But a lot of these areas, especially and we start to get into central South Carolina and so forth, are really starting to dry out right now. So now let's look at kind of from a long term and a short term. Here's the objective long term drought indices, and one of the things you'll notice as we talk about this is some of the inputs, and we go back 24 months, we go back 12 months and so forth. We go back a little bit longer, even 60 months in some cases for these inputs. So you'll notice that areas in northern Georgia, they still show dryness, but from a long-term outlook, they show kind of D2 conditions as opposed to what we're going to see here in a minute when we look at the short term. As we go a little further east and we look along the coast, they had been dry a little bit before that, but again, they look more normal as you look at this, even on the wet side as we get into the coastal Carolinas. And again, a lot of that has had to do with the recent tropical rainfall. When you start to look at the short term, and of course these are looking at a little bit different. They're looking at the Palmer Index, they're looking at the last 3 months, the last 1 month of precipitation, again, more short term type things. Then you see where we've really started to dry out in some of these areas and have D4 and D3 in much of Alabama, Georgia as we get up into Tennessee, the western South Carolina and so forth. And even as we look a little bit further east on the Carolinas, they show more near normal. And that's again the opposite, where we're seeing lots of rain and then dryness all around that. So again, something we're looking at pretty closely, but this is the short-term drought indicator. Now, I'm going back because this was the first time we saw any D1. In other words, not just abnormally dry, which is the yellow color, but moderate drought. This is the first time we saw moderate drought, and this was on April 26, 2016. And the reason I show this is I want to show you how quickly this drought has developed across the southeast, because it's amazing how quickly it's developed. So as we go from that time, which was at the end of April, beginning of May timeframe, and now we're at November 15th. So many of those areas, almost all of those areas had not seen just maybe some abnormally dry conditions, but we've seen extremely hot temperatures and we've seen extremely dry conditions, especially during the fall. And Chris will talk about this in a few minutes about why we've been so dry during this time. But again, a lot of it has to do with not receiving much tropical moisture and not getting much tropical in the way of tropical storms through the western part of our area, including Mississippi, Alabama, and Georgia.
All right, we wanted to start the meteorology portion today by taking a look at the upper air patterns that kind of landed into the situation where so much of the area is in drought. Looking at upper air patterns on a day-by-day basis probably isn't feasible for this sort of presentation, so what I'm going to do is go back to August and just at the beginning of the month and the middle of each month, from August through present day, take a look at these upper air patterns. So starting back at August, we have a pretty typical setup, a weak flow aloft, and this is the time of year where we see these pop-up thunderstorms. It was pretty standard, going into August, even to the middle of August. Here we had an area of high pressure over the Carolinas, but still we tended to see these pop-up thunderstorms, isolated areas receiving rainfall, but not a whole lot of widespread rainfall. As we go into September, so I didn't have an image from September 1st, but here's one from September 2nd. This is actually where we had Hurricane Hermine impacting the area. So it was an instance in the fall where we did have a good amount of rain across portions of the area, going from Florida into South Georgia up into the Carolinas. Saw a lot of precipitation associated with the tropical system. By the time we got into mid-September, however, we're under a ridge. And then as we went into October, we saw troughs around the area, but we didn't have a whole lot moving directly over the southeast U.S. So here's an example here, October 1st, where we had an area of low pressure to the north of us, but this didn't really amount to much precip over the southeast. Likewise, by middle of the month, here's an image from October 15th. Now we have a trough to the west of us, but kind of a similar story. So we had a little bit of precip with this, but not a whole lot. Getting into November, here's another example of where we have area high pressure over us, and we're not seeing any rain at all associated with this. Now getting close to present day, here's the most recent upper air image that we had in our archive from November 12th. This was an instance where we actually did have a trough move into the southeast U.S., move into the area from the north, and this did bring rain to the Carolinas, portion of Georgia. Still didn't see a whole lot of rain over Alabama. So what does this really mean? Just taking these snapshots, we kind of get a sense for how the pattern has been the past 3 months. So we've seen largely areas of high pressure over us. That means we don't get a ton of rain. A lot of downward motion, which suppresses thunderstorm formation. We see other instances where there were troughs nearby that had rain, but they weren't directly over the southeast U.S., or maybe it's just kind of a glancing blow. We get a little bit of rain with it. So this is largely what we've seen over the past few months. It's also important that we talk about the tropical systems that we've received this year. So this is the preliminary image for 2016, preliminary in that we're not done with the season yet, but it's what we've received so far. And these are the paths of the tropical system. I'm going to zoom in on the area closest to the southeast U.S. We could talk about specifically what we see in this image, but I think it's almost more important for this conversation that we talk about what we're not seeing here. So not seen in this image, we don't see Alabama at all. We don't see North Georgia, and even the Western Carolinas are just barely sneaking into the edge of this image. So really this shows that these areas where we're seeing the toughest drought, it's also where we haven't received tropical moisture this year. And I think that's a big portion of how we got here as well. So if those we talked about having high pressure over the area or having kind of glancing blows from these continental troughs. Like, even if that were the case, if they had a tropical system go through there, the precip accumulations would look much different. And it's also worth saying that if these areas that we see in this image had not received tropical systems, it'd be a much different story for them too. All right, with that in mind, I'd like to look ahead and let's talk about what we're expecting to see for the next week or so across the southeast U.S. We're starting the period with a cold front pushing eastward, and we're expecting to see rain in northeastern Mississippi and getting into like the Tombigbee region. But as this cold front pushes eastward, that upper level forcing associated with it's going to quickly diminish, and so we're not expecting to see too much precip as this front moves into Georgia. It looks like maybe northwest Georgia could get some rain. But even then, it doesn't look like a tremendous amount of rain associated with the passage of this system. As we get towards the end of the short term, we see high pressure moving back in, and that's going to carry into the midterm period. As we go through the midterm, we do see another area of low pressure approaching the region. And this is something that we're going to have to look at as we go into next week. So by next Wednesday, we see another front approaching the Tombigbee area. And at least a couple of models right now are showing some precip associated with this, but again, right now it doesn't look like a tremendous amount of rain. So we'll have to keep an eye on this as it gets closer to us to take a look at the precip totals associated with what we can expect from this system. Looking at the 7-day precip totals, we see the precip amount associated with that front in the short term, and also the start of what could be associated with that second precip late in the period towards the end of the midterm. Looking at the long-term outlook, we're expecting below normal chances for precip across much of the area, and this is keeping mostly with consistency and mostly a persistence forecast. We haven't been seeing a whole lot of rain. It looks like, at least into the near future, we can expect to see something similar.
So now that Chris has talked about the short and medium term and kind of what we've had in the past, I'll go out a little bit further. And again, as a broken record, I am La Nina. Continues to be a factor in our forecast. Next month we'll try and look at maybe some of the other factors that are impacting our weather and keeping us dry. But right now the La Nina looks to be at least one of the reasons that we continue to stay dry. So as we look to December and what we're expecting during December, this morning's forecast from the Climate Prediction Center shows continued below normal precipitation across the area. And as I mentioned, Chris gets us into the beginning of that, almost that beginning of December time frame, where we continue to have high pressure over the area, and so a sense of persistence on keeping that kind of pattern. The models are hinting at maybe seeing some rainfall, and we're not sure whether that's climatology trying to creep its way in, where we should be getting some normal rainfall. We're hoping that as we start to get closer to this rainfall that are in the models, that we'll start actually seeing some of that rainfall, but we'll just have to see. As for the December through February timeframe, a very traditional La Nina pattern is showing up on when in the CPC forecasts, and much dryness across southern Georgia down through Florida along the Gulf Coast, and then a gradient as we go up, where there's a chance we could still see close to normal, maybe at the tops of these basins. And that might be the silver lining to all this, is that even in a La Nina, sometimes we'll get a little bit of rain at the tops of those basins where we really need it right now. So we'll have to watch that. That's the December through February time frame, and here's the March through May time frame. And as we get out past that, we go into neutral conditions out in the Pacific for El Nino. And so because we get to that, there's no clear picture in the southeast of whether how it will impact the rainfall in the southeast. And so right now we show equal chances of above normal, near normal, or below normal rainfall as we get into the late spring and getting close to summer. And so that's the time that we start to dry out too. So hopefully we've improved by then, but we're going to have to watch this very closely. If we don't get enough rain during the winter time frame, that spring is going to be a little scary, all depending on what we see. We're hoping for rain, and we're hoping those aren't issues, but it's something we're going to have to watch very closely. So our bottom line, in the short term, it looks like continued dry weather for the southeast. It's been hard to break that pattern of high pressure over us, and so we're just going to have to watch it real closely and hope that maybe the models are hinting that we're starting to get maybe in a more wet pattern as we get into December. So that goes into the long term. The southeast looks to stay dry through the end of fall and into early winter as that high pressure continues to dominate over the southeast and keep the Gulf closed off from moisture for rainfall in the southeast. Again, we're hoping that models are leaning towards a little bit of wet weather at the end of the periods. Again, we're not sure whether that's climatology or whether it's actually going to happen. We'll just have to see. But we're planning our next water resources outlook on December 15th, and hopefully we'll have a little better news as we approach the middle of December.